song that we chose to share with you guys is actually a song from our home, Onichikskoponik. And in this song, we talk about the grand entry at a powwow. And then I like to translate our songs because they say when you understand what's being sung, you enjoy it more. And this one talks about as we come dancing into the arbor, we want to give thanks to the Creator once again. Hi, hi.
Welcome, folks. We are so excited to have you join us. In lieu of our wonderful Bernice EP Jordan, I will be doing the intros for us today. My name is Leila Cardi. I'm usually here behind the computer, not in front of it, but I'm glad to be here with you today. And we're going to go over our audience participation tips. We are building a community. Please introduce yourself in the chat if you have not already, selecting everyone so that everyone can read your message, and let your fellow participants know your name, tribal nation, affiliation, if applicable, job title, and organization. We value your partnership, and most importantly, for our attendance records, we need accurate data so that if you ask us for certificates, we can make sure that we get those to the right people. So if you're able, please change your name on Zoom if it is not clear from the name who you are. As well, everyone will be muted until the audience feedback portion of the hour, where Livia Davis will be joining us. So during that segment, please raise your hand and the host will unmute you, or you can put anything in the chat and we will welcome to hear more from you. And as well, you will receive a link to the recording and the presentation of this by the end of the week. For continuing education information, this activity is jointly provided by USET and Cardia Services. Cardia Services is approved as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the Montana Nurses Association, an accredited approver with distinction by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. This activity has been planned and implemented in accordance with the accreditation requirements and policies of the California Medical Association through the joint providership of Cardia and USET. Cardia is accredited by the CMA to provide continuing medical education for physicians. Cardia designates this live web-based training for a maximum of 1 AMA PRA category credits TM. Physicians should claim credit commensurate with the extent of their participation in this activity. As well, if at the completion of this activity, we will successful completion of the continuing education activity includes attending the entire presentation, completing the online evaluation that will be made available to you in the chat via a link within 2 weeks of the event, and then submitting an online CE request within 2 weeks of the event to Cardia. Your certificate will be sent via email, and if you have any questions about it, you can contact Haley Abila, and I will put that email in the chat so you can grab that out of there if you have any questions. And for disclosures, there are no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies for those involved with the ability to control the content of this activity. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Holly Echohawk to introduce us to today's presenter.
Thanks, Lee. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thank you all for we have many people on that are returning visitors. Kirsten, I see you. Thank you so much. And we have folks, of course, from our Canadian First Nation, our friends in Hawaii, Maryland, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Minnesota, Alaska, and others as they join. So welcome, welcome. As we always say, we designed this hour for you. This is your time out in your work, in your day to unplug and just really enjoy and listen to our presenters. And welcome, good friends, Yupik in Alaska. Thank you so much for joining. So today we're in for a special treat again because we were able to convince Dr. Evan White to come back and give us part 2 of the presentation he did last week. Evan is a tribal psychologist coming to us from Tulsa, Oklahoma today. And I'm so impressed with Evan because of his example of native brilliance. And he has focused his career on brain science. And I think brain science is under discussed. I think it's incredibly important for the work that we all do. And he's going to focus a little bit more on implications for patient care today. So I'll turn it over to Dr. White.
Sorry, no, I'm gonna close my office
Thank you
door.
for that introduction, Holly, and I appreciate you having me back here. Didn't take much. It was an honor to be asked to join you all even once, so I was glad to be back and expand a little bit on what we started talking about last time, hopefully with a little bit more contextualizing in terms of how we might take something abstract like neuroscience and start thinking about how does it actually plug into the work that we would do within our communities. And so, without further ado, I'll do a brief introduction. If you were here last time, please bear with me. I know this is a bit of a repeat, but there may be folks joining us only for part 2. And so I'd like to at least start with a little bit about who I am and kind of how I come to this work. And so, Evan White, I'm Evan White. I'm Shawnee from Oklahoma. I'm actually enrolled in the absentee Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma, but I'm descended from all 3 federally recognized bands of the Shawnee tribe, including the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma and the Shawnee tribe. And on screen, you can see a few pictures I've tried to share with my family, my wife Natalie, and our 2 kids, Benjamin and Lois. And then a recent meeting of our chapter of the Native American Church of Oklahoma in the springtime. So Oklahoma looks a lot different than that right now. But in any case, that was one of our recent group photos, and just some other things that I'd like to share about kind of who I am and how I come to this work. And before jumping into the specifics of the presentation, I like to provide a little bit of gratitude up front for the various institutions and supports that make this work possible, including my place of work, our partners at NIH that have funded this research, and various career development opportunities that I've received through universities and training programs. And I'm always happy to provide connections and things like that to these types of training programs and speak highly of them. They've been instrumental in my career. And so if there's things that people are interested in pursuing, or they know of younger folks or people switching careers, or if folks that are still in training towards these types of topics, I'm always happy to try to connect people with opportunities for increasing their skill set and ability to serve our Native people through various fields that touch psychology and mental health. And then a little bit more close to home for me, gratitude for the research team that's really instrumental in helping this work happen from day to day. So you can see a long list of folks that have been instrumental over the past few years in helping to gather some of the data, analyze the data that we'll talk about a little bit today, and then some of the institutional and community partners that are engaged throughout some of this research. And so I like to mention them up front, just so that you know, as we're going through, even though I get the pleasure of presenting to you all today, there's a lot of folks that are involved in making this work possible. So as a brief outline for our part 2 today, I have a couple of reminders from my first presentation, and maybe a little bit of catching up for those of you maybe who are joining us today and haven't had a chance to see part 1 yet. A couple of critical components from that first presentation that I think are relevant to keep in mind today. And then I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about some of the myths and facts related to substance use, and particularly what we call substance use disorder, to try to start thinking about why this type of work might be particularly important as we engage with community partners and community clinics who may be operating in spaces where the distinction between information that's current and patient-centered and forward-thinking in terms of evidence-based practice versus myths about substance use that folks may have to contend with. And then using that as a segue into how we consider that type of information when we are doing a neuroscience type research. So try to connect the dots between the context that this work is happening in and these very specific lab brain science studies that we might engage in here at LIBOR, and then try to build this back out too through the idea of what can we do in the future from this information. So as we're learning and gaining insights about brain function related to substance use disorder, how does this then impact the particular implications for clinical practice, and integrating, which is my long-term hope for the work that we're doing, facets of culture into our resilience frameworks and our treatment frameworks and our prevention frameworks. And so hopefully we'll end on that note and lead us there in a way that makes sense and can get us all there. So one first reminder I want to provide, or a review from our first presentation together, is this concept of regenerative research. And so this concept really is about how we should conduct research in partnership with community that does a couple of things. From my perspective, the most important thing it does is it really centers community perspectives and community input in the research process. And of course, that's identified as a particular component here in the cycle, as you can see. But in reality, it's the water that this research swims in, so to speak. It's really community input at each level of this process. And in particular, when we talk about perspectives, the reason I like to center that in the cycle is to think about it as, what is the perspective of the people that we are trying to serve, the communities that we want to invest in terms of resources, and what's the perspective from that community on the problems and potential solutions and challenges that exist for within that context. And that is where we can then start to inform our research questions, the design, recruitment, analysis, and interpretation, and then also where the information goes, or as we might refer to it as dissemination. But as you can see, this process is really more of a cycle than a particular start and finish line. When we're engaged with community partners at each step, we make sure that the research process is conducted appropriately. We make sure that the interpretations of the data and how the project is executed have um, community driving forces behind them. And then when it comes to getting that information out, we're not just sending this out into scientific journals, which I'm not decrying that as a problem to publish scientifically. However, it's important to keep in mind that oftentimes the communities and clinics where we're trying to work, the information that's most helpful and the packaging of that information that's most helpful isn't always a journal article and some academic outlet, but sometimes it might look like infographics or white papers for policymakers, or even I've seen examples of social media campaigns that distill this type of information so that public health departments can reach a broader audience of community members. So there's lots of different ways that community can be involved in getting the research out. And oftentimes that feeds right back into the next cycle of research. So that's the idea of regenerative research. And the other critical factor to keep in mind here is, where does culture come into the picture from the perspective of, let's say, mental health science broadly? We follow a model in my lab that was published a little over 20 years ago called the Indigenous Stress Coping Model. And what this model suggests is that there are stressors, and in this case in particular, trauma and various types of trauma exposures that put us at risk as human beings for a variety of potential health outcomes. And what this model suggests is that our engagement with our traditional culture, whether that's our identity or engagement in traditional practices, engagement with traditional healers, our spirituality, that these protective factors serve as a buffer that kind of reduce the impact of these risk factors on these potential health outcomes. And of course, as a psychologist, I kind of narrow my focus here on substance use and mental health outcomes, because that's really my area of expertise. Not to say that the physical health outcomes aren't important. It's just this is where my expertise lies. And in particular, I'm very interested in the process that, in terms of an individual, how is it that these cultural expressions convey this protective effect, and not just as a matter of curiosity, but really thinking through what is it about, what is it in our cultures, how does it impact our bodies in a way that promotes health? Because this is a way that we can start to translate the information that's shared through generations of our culture into a scientific healthcare framework that can serve future generations of Native people using the best tools available to us from mental health science and neuroscience. And so thinking about some myths regarding substance use addiction, this may be not news to some of you, and maybe it is, but in any case, I'd like to just review some of the top myths, things that we hear in the community about addiction that have really been shown to not be true, but often are still held by individuals who are struggling with substance use and individuals who aren't, but have strong opinions about substance use. And in some cases, these may even be policymakers or in some cases, healthcare providers. So the first myth I wanted to address here is that addiction is somehow a moral failing or a weakness of will. And we know that this is not the case, and that in fact, we have a long list of scientific evidence that shows that in reality, addiction is best conceptualized as a disruption in brain function that's chronic, but is also very treatable. we also see the myth that people have to hit rock bottom before any treatments will work. It's like they have to get to the end of the line before we can ever help. And in reality, what we see is that there's lots of opportunities to engage people in effective treatment at many stages of substance use engagement, including even prevention efforts early in life. And then another myth is that when somebody relapses, it means all the treatments that they've engaged in have failed. And this is also untrue. In reality, it signals that treatment needs adjusted rather than defeat. And here's a point I like to make oftentimes. If any of you have ever had strep throat or some other type of infection, you've taken an antibiotic, you've gotten over the infection, and then maybe it recurs in the future, we would never think about this as a failing of an antibiotic that you took a long time ago. It might be just, well, I need to re-engage in this treatment because this type of problem has come up again. And it doesn't seem intuitive to us. And I would argue that the reason this type of thing doesn't seem intuitive to us is because we're in a information environment that has created a separate category for addiction rather than it as a health concern. And so actively trying to reframe our substance use problems as health concerns, I think, is an active effort that we should all be involved in. And then lastly, that one of the best treatments we have for some substance use difficulties is medication-assisted treatment, and that this just swaps one drug for another. And this is an oversimplification. And in fact, that we have approved medications that impact brain chemistry and also reduce risk of overdose. And so the idea that this is just swapping one substance dependence for another is really an oversimplification. Extending on that, I'd like to talk about just a few facts that I think everyone should be able to know and disseminate about substance use and treatment and things of that nature. And that one of the things is that we see that substance dependence or addiction changes the brain and it changes the fun. And I should say this isn't a special case for addiction here. Everything we do is processed within our brain, and so there's anything that we're engaging in has what we could call neural correlates, or the kind of things that the brain functions that are associated with anything or another. And we know that recovery is possible, particularly when we start to engage in evidence-based care. I think that those treatments can be improved and that we're still learning a lot about this, as you might guess from my position at a brain research institute. But we know that recovery is possible through these types of care strategies. Also, that early intervention saves lives. And this is the counterpoint to that end of the road, rock bottom myth, is that the earlier that we're screening and treating problems as quickly as they can, we can intervene upstream of severe negative consequences. And that early intervention and prevention efforts do save lives. Also, that recovery is a journey. It's something that as human beings, we go through ups and downs in all parts of our lives, and substance use recovery is no different. And that we should be providing ongoing support as caregivers, whether that's through our profession or through other relationships that we have. Providing that support to improve outcomes is an important facet here. And then lastly, that stigma is a barrier. And so oftentimes we may have the tendency, and it's been kind of the common parlance to center a disorder, something like addiction, versus individuals with substance use disorder. So even sometimes just flipping the script to recognize that a substance use difficulty is something that a person is going through, not necessarily a characteristic that defines that person. And again, here I appeal to the kinds of illnesses and things that we deal with in a physical consideration, where we've kind of overcome that stigma around whether that's other types of healthcare systems. These are difficulties that we deal with, not things that define us. So in thinking about this broader context of how substance use and substance use difficulties play out for individuals, that was one of the early questions I had in my research is, in what ways are we overlooking the context for these difficulties and other mental health difficulties in our communities? And so I'd like to segue into some of the work that we've done to try to really understand and look at the implications of this context. And so one of the things that we did was to look at data that was available here at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research, thinking about how we contextualize these mental health disparities. And one of the ways that this is researched here is using a very specific regulatory process called inhibitory control. And this function is something that helps us to engage in various self-regulation. And so in terms of contextualizing this risk, one thing that we have seen in the literature is that that often leads to additional myths about substance use disorder is that we see higher rates of substance use disorders in Native populations relative to other populations, which an important counterpoint I would be remiss to mention is that we also see the highest rates of abstinence. But in any case, we often see these increased in problematic outcomes, and people infer lots of information about why that is the case. And in my opinion, I think that those statistics overlook a very important contextualization in the prevalence of significant risk factors. So one example that I thought of is something like post-traumatic stress disorder. The reason I think of this is because there's a very specific thing that has to happen, which is exposure to trauma that precedes developing post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if we see an increase in PTSD in a particular population, but we don't, or we ignore the occurrence of the risk factor trauma, then what we're doing is missing the context where we can actually intervene in order to help reduce that disparity. And so one of the things that we did here was to think about the risk factors for things like substance use disorder and another pernicious mental health problem in our communities, which is suicide risk. And what I did was to take a comparison sample of individuals who were non-American Indian and create a balance in our data based on various risk factors, as you can see in this table. So what we have here is age. We also have what's called the WARAT, which is an indicator of neurocognitive functioning, basic things of income, and then a variety of different psychological measures that measure the impacts of trauma. And not to say any one of these things is particularly important, but basically to say all of these things have been shown to be related to risk for substance use and related to risk for suicide. And if we're not looking at that context, any differences we're seeing across populations is going to be oversimplified. And when we do take this into account, what we see is actually that the risks for suicide in this same data was quite a bit reduced relative to the majority population. So when we're actually looking at the context, we're seeing evidence of resilience and potential protection against these issues. And so what this is telling me is that, in fact, this particular outcome of suicide risk is really a result of a very difficult environment that we know stems from a long history of disenfranchisement and difficulties that the population has faced that have accumulated external risks. And another example of this is when we look accounting for this, we see almost no differences in the occurrence of substance use disorder across the lifetime in this sample. And statistically fairly equivalent in this particular data set. And this is just more evidence to me that the context with which we're measuring these problems is a very important thing. And so then my question is, how can I take that context and make some important information about it relative to our brain functioning? And this is where we use the stop signal task. So think of it as a very boring video game. And really what we're trying to do is to put people in a situation where their brain is challenged to not do something that they're already primed to do. So we're just asking people to respond to very basic things in a very bit boring video game. And every so often we're like, wait, stop. And then we measure what's going on in the brain at that exact moment we ask people to wait and stop. Because that brain activity is significantly related to our ability to regulate emotions, to inhibit cravings, and to regulate our behavior in other ways. It's not the only function, but it's definitely a foundational component. And what we see, if you is particularly we're interested in activity in the prefrontal cortex around this, and what we are looking at here is that in the bigger sample that this data is pulled from, we are getting activation in the parts of the brain that we should be for this. And when we compare individuals who report no risk for suicide, so it's not something that occurs to them, versus people that express any level of risk, uh, granted, no one in the study was actively in danger, or else they would have been included in the study. But what we see is individuals that have no risk have greater activation in this kind of self-regulatory network relative to other individuals, suggesting that maybe there's a very particular process that we can look into in terms of targeting for our future treatments. And this is just a more conservative approach to analyzing the same data that just looks at the whole brain and says, where's the most important brain activity for this particular type of process? And it's really because I have a hard time trusting some of these informations, and I want to make sure that we're doing the best we can in terms of data. And when we put the most stringent criteria in the field, or at least a very conservative set of criteria in the field on this data, we do show the same types of results. We show activity in the same types of brain regions that seem to be implicated in this kind of cognitive control network. So this is more just verification that the data that we have is telling us what we think it is. Now, just in the note of time, I want to go through a couple of slides a little quickly. We also looked at this in terms of reward and loss processing. So in addition to self-regulation, another thing that's important is how sensitive is our brain to rewards and losses. And what we've shown is that, in fact, it's really not the reward. So we look at the reward networks in the brain, you can see here in three panels. If we compare individuals who don't have any kinds of health conditions to individuals who report some level of substance use disorder, they're basically similar, except for in response to, in another boring video game, the highest magnitude loss condition. So when people are losing at a video game and they know that they've just lost some points, or in this case, a very small amount of bonus compensation, we see that their individuals with substance disorder seem to be less sensitive to those higher magnitude losses than healthy controls. So again, now we're starting to get a larger picture of how we might support these types of systems. And all of these graphs do is to show that it's not just some arbitrary activation in the brain that's different. We actually see that the behavior that people are engaging in during the task is significantly related to that. And this is just a way of verifying that the brain measurements we're taking actually have real world implications as well. And so trying to zoom back out, how do we take this brain information and make it into something that can impact how we're working with individuals in a clinic? And I think what we're seeing here are hints. These are not definitive studies yet. We're working towards a larger set of data and making them more treatment focused. However, we can start to think about future directions, and that when we're looking at how culture supports individuals, maybe we want to focus on the aspects of culture that really impact self-regulation and our ability to be sensitive to rewards and loss and things like this. And one of the things that we're doing here is centering protective facts of cultural identity, like the stress coping model, and that we're actually in the process here in the lab, and we talked about it a little bit last time, of tailoring neuroscience tools to indigenous cultures so that we can try to impact those same brain networks that we see disruptions in through culturally appropriate methods. And then also we are advocating for pairing evidence-based interventions with culturally grounded supports, whether that's in some cases there's examples of using traditional healers and in healthcare contexts and things of that nature. And then, of course, honoring tribal sovereignty through legitimate research partnerships, which we've engaged in here in the lab as well. And then a really important feature that I would be remiss if I don't mention is treating culture as a framework. Culture is not a unitary thing. It's not one thing that can be picked up and dropped into any context. It's really an umbrella term for lots of different aspects of how we define ourselves as human people, how we relate to other people, and how we benefit ourselves and our communities to promote well-being. So here are just some examples about translating this work into community efforts and things that we're actively engaged in. So that designing clinical trials with our partners to make sure that we're focused on well-being and doing things in a culturally appropriate way. We're also working to develop and deploy digital interventions that are scalable, but also have culturally relevant content. Of course, the regenerative research model and supporting that. And also ensuring that the things that we're engaged in on a larger scale. So one of the things that's gaining a lot of traction are big, large scale data, and these types of things are difficult when it comes at the intersection of ideas like data sovereignty and broader expressions of sovereignty. And so being thoughtful about how we engage policymakers to promote sovereignty and indigenous well-being is an important component of translating cultural neuroscience into community impact as well. And with that, I'll stop, and I think it's a good timing to turn it over for questions and feedback, I hope. Maybe is it best to stop sharing?
Sorry about that issue with the muting. That was on me as the technical host, but it should be fixed. So please attempt and feel free to speak freely.
I was about to try to use some sign language, Evan. I couldn't unmute to tell you. That's really fascinating. And I guess what I'm interested in hearing from other folks that are in direct care is ideas or questions that you have about how can some of this information actually be applied in treatment settings or ramping up certain parts of treatment. And then I know that Olivia has been monitoring the chat, and she'll kind of take it from here to I think she can unmute herself too.
I can now, but do you want to ask Dr. Evan White to respond to that first? And then we will go to Sean Haynes, and also there is a chat from Rick Escobedo we'll get to in a minute.
Okay, sure. And then for the audience to know, two of our clinical advisors are also on the call, Dr. Jackie Vorpal and Ken Craybill. And they might be able to kind of refine my question to Evan. So come off mute if you'd like to help refine that question.
Well, I'm going to try to refine it, but I don't know. You did a nice job. So, Evan, I'm just wondering if you could share some concrete ways that neuroscience is coming into, the work with our communities. Like, is there psychoeducation? Is there ways that, they're practicing different things? Are the clinicians being trained and using different kinds of strategies, and does knowing about this neuroscience, does that help people with stigma in communities? So that's a lot of questions, Evan.
No, that's a great question, and I appreciate you framing it that way because uh, I really feel like there's the current state of things, but also that the impact from my perspective of neuroscience and the types of research we're engaged in on how we treat substance use disorders and recovery is not a settled question. So the hopefully, and I would say optimistically, that the answer to this question will become more refined over time, and there will be more and more examples of this. But your question actually implied one of the important benefits so far is in fact the framing of what's happening at a biological level when somebody is struggling with a substance use disorder. The fact that we can track differences in the brain, differences in other biological structures as well that are impacted for individuals that are struggling with these disorders, I think helps individuals understand their own difficulties more. And also, it helps to combat stigma around some of the myths that we talked about early on. Because I think that anytime we can point to a specific brain function or a specific biological process that we know has a disruption that's related to these types of conditions, whether it's substance use disorder or other types of mental health and behavioral health concerns, it helps us to recognize that this is, again, a struggle that someone's dealing with and not a defining feature of who they are. And so that's an important way. But I also think extending beyond just understanding the problem, one of the ways that neuroscience is helping us in terms of treating individuals is also the types of treatments that we're engaging in and why we focus on a particular component of, let's say, of treatment that targets, stress regulation or self-regulation. It's because we have information from clinical neuroscience and things like that that show these are some of the important brain functions that are most related to substance use disorders and things like that. And again, these are not settled science, but we are starting to have good implications of, the reward and punishment processing networks or self-regulation networks that are important. And when we can tie these types of disruptions to specific activities, in addition to helping us refine our treatment approach, it also helps us communicate the importance of aspects of treatment to individuals that are engaging with them. And at least that's how I would answer that question at this point in time. And hopefully we'll have more evidence and more good examples as we continue this work.
Thank you. I wanted to see if Dr. Sean Haynes had a question. You had your hand up. Did you lower it again or did you have it answered?
I was appreciating the response and giving the process time. Thanks, Livia. Dr. White, I'm in Canada, and I appreciate the tremendous efforts that you put in working with community. As we look at neuroscience, there's a wholeness inside of me that goes, have we remembered the care in health? And in the process of your work, you remembered the care in your health, the work with the community, the wraparound, the efforts. I've been in different situations, so I'll share what I've learned. I don't know if it would ever help, because sometimes I just go, where do I begin? So in one situation, I brought two feathers, one an eagle feather and one a hawk feather. And the families repeatedly said, oh, Sean, Dr. Sean, can I just hold the hawk feather? It's more gentle. And the tears would come and the health would grow, but they understood the care. I don't know how that helps. It transcends so much. The other time was I brought moose hide and deer hide. They're not the same. They could probably smell the birch log that caused the smoke, and they could feel at home and the care as they touched it. Because our unique needs are unique. Oh, it was the deer hide, Dr. White. Every time, as strong as they were, oh, Dr. Sean, you brought the deer hide. How do we translate care with neuroscience? So as you present your data, I commend you, because the way I hear your care is your commitment to community as we provide care with you, as the health is included. So that's what my Indigenous Canadian ears heard. And I thank you for your tremendous work. I just want to add a little aside. Just before this meeting, a red-tailed hawk flew over my house. May the blessings be with you, Holly. Naiwan.
Thank you for that reflection and sharing the stories and thinking about situating neuroscience in this space. I want to be mindful that one of the major goals of my work is not to say all roads have to go through neuroscience for recovery. And in fact, I would argue that many roads won't go through neuroscience for recovery. But what I would advocate is that there are important insights that seem to be coming through the advancement of clinical neuroscience in the broader healthcare community. And what I would hope is that the work that we are doing can make the tools of neuroscience available as a toolkit that's open and available to Indigenous communities everywhere, and really all people everywhere, in an appropriate way that's accessible, that honors the communities that are engaging with this technique and centers their priorities and voices, and that Native people have a seat at the table in determining how these tools get used and impact health. And so that's the addition I'd like to put onto that reflection, and hopefully that is meaningful. And again, I just want to express gratitude for your sharing the reflections and stories that you did.
Well, thank you both. We have a question from Rick Escobedo. He is basically asking if the Laureate Institute for Brain Research is familiar or engaged in research with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy that has been shown to be effective to treat substance abuse and dependence and mental health conditions.
Yeah, I'm familiar with this area of research. I've read a lot about it. I've even reviewed some studies pre-publication looking at various psychoactive psychedelics. in terms of their cognitive functional implications. And it is something that seems to be gaining a lot of traction, and there's some good preliminary evidence that this may be a new area of pharmacological interventions that are helpful. We are not engaged in any research here at the library using psychedelics, and I haven't been a part of any teams that are actively running any of those studies, but I'm aware of the traction that they're gaining in the field.
Great. And one last question, then I'll turn it over to you, Holly. This is from Sandy Bates. I read some clinical trial resistance by tribal members. Is the community aspect of everyone being included? She's saying clinical trials by nature have one group getting treatment and one group not getting treatment. And are there examples of how clinical trials can be structured that could mediate those concerns?
Absolutely. That's a great question, and there's a very straightforward answer. Not always the case, but in this case, there has been a lot of development in this. Essentially, one of the ways that this is addressed is through what's called a crossover waitlist control design. And essentially, what this design does is to say, okay, if we need two groups to try to say we're going to look at the influence of a particular treatment versus non. What we can first do is make sure in the context, is the treatment something that's an immediate need for someone? And that should be a rule out for engaging in the clinical trial, and not to say that they can't get treatment, but to say that they need to go through be routed to treatment first as a priority. And if it's not an imminent thing, then what we can do is say, okay, this is the length of the course of treatment. So group one is going to go through treatment, and we'll do our typical pre-post measurement that you would do in a clinical trial design. And then we'll have another group of people that we'll say are not going through treatment at that time. And we do a pre-post just based on timing, or maybe it's a wait list control, maybe it's treatment as usual, or there's some other comparison group. There's a lot of different ways that can be done. But then at the end point, then we flip the groups and we say, okay, now we're going to treat that measurement as pre-post for a second time point. And the people who already went through treatment will go back to usual or wait list or whatever the comparison group is. And the folks in the comparison group will then go through treatment. So everyone has access to the treatment at some point. The timing is slightly different. And then you get a little bit more information about the time course of engaging in treatment. And in the group that did the treatment early, you can even get some more longitudinal data about how does the treatment impact people for a longer period of time. So there are a lot of creative solutions to being inclusive in terms of clinical trial design. And I should say that's my overview. There are clinical trials experts who could probably give you much more complicated designs about being inclusive as well.
Thank you so much. Holly, there was one additional question from Ken Crable, and anything, I'm gonna just ask it, Dr. White, before turning it over. Could you just share a little bit about why culture is at the core of recovery healing in your your thoughts around that?
Well, that's a tough question for a quick answer, but I'll do my best. And all this to say, I'll give the best concise overview that I can, but noting that I could probably talk for days about this. The most concise way I can put it is, in my view, well-being, healing is in fact one of the core goals of culture. And I think of culture as it's how a community of people defines ourselves, defines our relationships to each other, the world around us, our past generations, our future generations, with the goal of promoting a good life, a well life. And so when that's centered at how we're continuing our culture through generations, I feel like there's no other way for culture to be expressed that's removed from recovery and healing. And hopefully that's not too abstract of a concept, but I think of, we think of culture, sometimes we get caught up in the details of some of the surface level components, But at its core, I really view culture as a way of expressing continuity through a people, through time and through relationships that centers well-being and living a good life. And so I don't see how it could be any other way that it's not core to our recovery and healing.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Holly?
Mhm. That was really fabulous. Dr. White, you did I'm so glad you came back in general, but specifically because you um, really it was a leaning forward presentation, just really absorbing what you had to say and in terms of treatment and recovery. So can't thank you enough. And Ken Craybill, thank you for that question about culture as the core. Why is culture at the core of recovery and healing? And you're right, Evan, we could talk days, weeks, demonstrate it in our own, families and communities, cultural beliefs. But I'll use that as a segue to the next slide, Lee. Well, that's not the segue to evaluation. Uh, but what I wanted to touch base on before I do this, talk about these, is the music and the songs we use. That's an example of culture at the core of healing. And we intentionally, and I know you all enjoyed as much as we do, pick something for the beginning and end of each session. And the reason we do that is because culture is the core, we believe, of recovery and healing. And I think I've been thinking about this lately, Evan, because I think we know it almost genetically, but Native people that I work with, and myself included, we're not really that good about describing it. And but because we know it so well, but we're not very great about putting it into words. So in my thinking about it, and the segue to these other slides and the final music is I think it has to do with sense of place. And I don't mean, well, double ways you could use the sense of place. One is feet on the ground, our ancestral lands, if you're lucky enough to be living on your ancestral lands or or visit, but also sense of place within a tribe. Some of the most powerful exchanges I've witnessed of tribal elders welcoming back people who are in addiction, living in an addiction world. Um, One is there's no scolding. Uh, I witness elders talking to their tribal members that were in addiction, saying, "Welcome home. You're important. We need you. You're a member of this tribe, and we need you as a tribal member." And those messages, without scolding or shaming, is that kind of sense of place that I think some people, and maybe many people that have slid into an addiction world, move away from their sense of place in terms of being a tribal member. So that, in addition to what you were saying, Evan, is what I've been trying to think more about to answer. And thank you, Ken, for that question, because that's a question politicians ask or wonder. Maybe they don't ask it out loud. Decision makers ask that question or think about it. And I'm really trying to figure out ways to better explain it to people who are live in a different non-native world, but who have a lot of power and influence in terms of funding and resources and all of that. So and that's why part of the reason why we use the videos that we use. And we intentionally picked Fawn Woods and her sister Tia, and then we have another one to show at the end. But if you can go back to those other slides really quick, Lee, please, I'll run through those because we are just about at the end. And there's the link to the evaluation. You all know about all of that. And the next one, and thank you for putting the survey in the chat. Next the next 2 months, we've decided to do something special for you all and talk about trauma exposure in the community. We actually changed the title. It's trauma exposure in uh, community work and the role of supportive supervision. It's a new thing that we've been working on, and Dr. Vorpal and Ken and I will be doing that for you all, 2 parts, next month and the month after. So it's going to be really great. I think you'll enjoy it. And then the next slide is our partnerships. We have a new partner, which is the American Indian Alaska Native Behavioral Health Center of Excellence based out of the University of Arizona. Love these guys, love working with them. Then the next slide, I think it's our video. So what we thought we'd do for the end, and it's going to go just a few minutes over, so if you can hang with us, we thought we would promote our Canadian Native young people's group called We Matter. And so first we're going to show you a 1 minute, I think it's a minute and a half video of one of the two brother-sister founders of the We Matter. And I don't know if it'll be big full screen or not, but
We Matter is a national campaign for Indigenous youth. It was started by my sister and I. We're First Nations from the Northwest Territories in Northern Canada, and we believed that we could come up with something new and different to reach out to Indigenous youth, because there's so many issues of suicide, with depression, with people who aren't perhaps living life to their fullest potential, especially our young people. And We Matter has a simple idea. We're gathering short video messages, 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minutes, from role models across the country, and people send these videos in. Anybody can create one, where people are sharing their own experiences and sending a message of hope to Indigenous youth. The reason why we felt so strongly about it is because it was in our talents, basically, we knew we could do it, and we knew it could make a difference. So we said, let's do it. Like, why not? Let's create it, and let's see if it can take on a life of its own. And I think that was important to us, that feeling of we can, so we will.
And that is an example of young Native brilliance. They said, we can do it. We're young. We know technology. We're going to do it. And it did take off. It's hundreds and hundreds of video shorts. We're going to show you one sample right now.
Ani, Mr. Nimki Dijnakas, Wikwemkong Donjba. I work as a land-based teacher, educator, coach for the Wukamakong Board of Education. And stories of resilience and stories of our experiences are so important in terms of being able to share our successes and how we get through life as Nishnabek. I've learned that the land itself is a teacher. I've learned that those stories from the land and the stories of our elders are what gives us the passion to continue. One of the things I'd like to say to youth is, life is like a canoe journey. If you're going down the river, you encounter rapids, you find a way through. You find a way to get around the rocks. If you fall out of the canoe, you climb back in. If you want to get to your destination, you have to keep paddling. So, the best way to get through life, learn from the elders, learn from the land, and never give up.
That's one example of the hundreds that they have. They're from tribal officials, they're from kids, they're from moms, they're from uncles, and they're all 1, 2, or 3 minutes down on their cell phone. And Lee, thank you for putting the information. And you notice on Kelvin's shirt, it said, I matter, you matter, we matter. And it's We Matter. The email address is wemattercampaign.org, it's founded by a brother and sister with not a nickel to their name. They didn't need, he used to tell me, we didn't need no stinking organization. We know how to do it. We know technology. We're just going to do it. And they did. And it took off. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking with us a little bit past the hour. Love to see every one of you every month, and we'll see you next month.